Good day, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. We are 32 days away from the momentous 2024 U.S. election, though early voting is already underway in a growing number of states. And while Vice President Kamala Harris enjoys a remarkably steady lead in national and key battleground polls, this election is clearly on a razor's edge. And following Tuesday's vice presidential debate, there are essentially no major scheduled events on the calendar between now and Election Day, though the proverbial October surprise is ever looming. Here today to discuss the state of the race and the dynamics to watch, I'm joined by two guests. Jonathan Martin is the politics bureau chief and senior political columnist at Politico. Previously, he was the national political correspondent at the New York Times, serving as the paper's top political reporter for nearly a decade. He's also the co-author of a couple of books, most recently the New York Times bestseller, This Will Not Pass, Trump, Biden, and the Battle for America's Future. He joins us today for the first time. We're also joined by my colleague and Jonathan's friend, Nate Tamarin, who is a senior managing director and the head of our Washington, D.C. office, where he leads our government and public affairs offerings. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Kevin.
Let's just jump right into it. Jonathan, maybe I can start with you here. As I sort of mentioned at the top, the New York Times average of polls currently shows that Harris has got about a 3 percentage point lead. It's been remarkably steady. Polls also showing that the expectation of her winning continues to gain momentum, whatever that means. And she seems to be edging ahead in essentially all and on every attribute question, with the exception of immigration and the border, of course. Everybody's favorite / least favorite statistician and poker player, Nate Silver, says this is the tightest race he's ever seen. Harris has got the edge, but it's so slight that Democrats shouldn't be taking any comfort from it. But at the end of the day, said you'd still rather be her than Trump right now. So. Yep. Given all of that, I guess I'd love to hear your assessment of the state of the race right now and what you're watching and just sort of your take.
Look, the big question that people like Nate and everybody who has worked or works in campaigns is asking themselves is one thing. Is Trump going to outperform his polls for a third straight election?
Right.
We obviously use public opinion research. We rely on polling. I think it's an essential part of covering politics. And frankly, folks who work in politics rely on it, of course, as well. But we just don't know. Yeah, she's leading in narrowly in a lot of the battleground states now. Her numbers have improved generally in terms of her favorability ratings. But the big question looming over this race is in 16 and 20, Trump outran the public polling considerably and narrowly won a plurality victory in 16, and then of course narrowly lost in 2020 in the electoral college. So it's hard to cover a race. It's hard to run campaigns, frankly, when we don't know how effective polling is going to be when it comes to one party's nominee. But here's the thing. It's also, and I'd be curious for Nate's view on this, it's also entirely possible that the shy Trump voter, to borrow a phrase that the Brits used, that maybe they're shy Harris voters this time around, that maybe the polling is sort of undercounting what Harris is going to get because people are just so sick of Trump that they're going to vote for her but not admit it to a pollster. So, yes, the polling suggests right now it's a competitive, knife's edge race with the slightest advantage to Harris, but that's going on polling, and we don't know if Trump's going to outperform or underperform his polling this time around.
So I want to get Nate involved in the conversation, but just one quick question for you. And I know we won't know this until afterwards, of course, but what's your take on, or what are you hearing with regards to methodological changes that the polls have taken, and does that give you confidence, or are you kind of like, well, we're going to really have to
yes, they have taken steps since 16 to account for what is basically the non-responsiveness of a lot of Republican voters who just don't answer their phone or won't take surveys, or really just sort of don't engage in a lot of kind of mainstream events generally, or institutions, I should say. So yes, they've taken steps to account for more Republicans who are not taking polls. to account for folks that don't have college degrees, typically are undercounted at polling. So yeah, they've tried to do that, but we still don't necessarily know um, uh, what that's going to look like. There are ominous signs, though, beyond the horse race for Harris. Obviously with members of union households, with non-college voters generally across racial lines, her numbers are not even where Biden's were 4 years ago. Now, can she make up for that by doing better among college educated voters? Potentially in a handful of states. But Democrats are seeing a sort of we talk more about this broader educational realignment that is dividing voters by class that creates real challenges for the party with the electoral college.
So speaking of that electoral college, Nate, let me bring you in here and let's talk about the current pathways to 270, because even though we've just talked about that national polling advantage, she also continues to have a at least within the it looks like about a 2-point margin in the major swing states. And I know Jonathan put out a piece in Politico a couple of weeks ago that the actual electoral map is 3 states: Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. But Nate, what's your take and read here currently on this front?
It is true that she's got a slight edge in enough states to get to 270 right now. But to your earlier point, not anything that gives anyone on the Harris team or in the Democratic Party any sense of comfort that that lead is anything more than ephemeral right now.
Right.
The truth is that even in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, where she is narrowly ahead in most polling averages, that is a very, very slight lead, and certainly within the margin of error, and certainly something that can be affected by any number of other considerations. And I know we'll get to it, but we are just now getting into the point where field efforts are starting to kick in, where get out the vote becomes a real consideration, and the quality of each campaign's field operations is really going to be tested. Where, to Jonathan's point, that question of what votes you can bank and who you can get in early and where you can find a way to beef up your base numbers really gets tested. And all of those things are going to have an effect at the end of the day on a race that is as tight as this one is. So her pathway is obviously very, very real, but so is Donald Trump's. And he is still going to be fighting it out in each of these, call it 7 battleground states at this point. Look, we've got, I think, Harris with slight edge in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I think it is harder to assess exactly who is ahead, but you could give a slight lead to Trump in Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, depending on what polls you're looking at. And obviously, a big consideration right now is we're not going to have any reliable polling out of North Carolina for some time. And among the many things that folks in North Carolina have other things to worry about, they are not going to be answering phones from pollsters.
Right.
Yeah.
And they shouldn't. And the humanitarian concerns in the region are 100% real and are the priority. But it does mean that there is going to be a big question mark around all sorts of things beyond polling, aligning with voter registration deadlines, early vote deadlines, and obviously the question of polling places, mail-in ballots, and a whole sort of other things. All that stuff will get sorted out later, but right now the priority is obviously on the humanitarian side. But it does mean that if you're an election expert or a political prognosticator, to a degree, you have to kind of park North Carolina off to the side right now and just focus on those other states. So what does that mean? It means that we're going to be looking for and searching for other data points across the 6 other battleground states. Polling, we're going to be looking at the early vote numbers as they come in. We're going to be looking at the quality of the field operations, the doors knocked, the phone calls made, the voter contact made. We're going to be looking at the ad spend. We're going to be looking at the quality of the ads from both the campaigns and the third-party groups that are active in those states. Still not going to get any sense of a crystal ball out of any of this, I don't think.
And just on that point you made, is there any early anecdotal evidence with regards to what early voting trends are looking like, just in terms of the numbers, even if the votes aren't being counted, but in terms of who's coming out, et cetera, in these battleground states?
It's too early, and at this point, I wouldn't really put too much stock in it in any case. The truth is, Democrats put a lot more emphasis on early vote. They really try to get their voters to the polls well ahead of Election Day to the degree possible, more so than Republicans do. So you would really have a difficult time at this point in the process really assessing any trends. Obviously, the further we get into the early voting process and as it starts to pick up in these battleground states, there will be comparisons between 2020, between 2016 in a way that could end up being helpful. But, at the end of the day, it's not really going to be that determinative in trying to assess what the strength of these operations are. It's just going to be a data point along the way.
So, you both have made this point about how close this election is, which I think, echoes what we're hearing, everywhere, essentially. I do wonder, though, we're only 2 days away from the vice presidential debate. It's worth just commenting for 1 second on that, if there was anything to take away from that debate that impacts what we're talking about here, the actual election, one way or the other. I mean, it was notable to me that on the policy front, it was clearly a more substantive conversation than either of the presidential debates thus far have been. JD Vance sort of came across as the more slickly prepared until he got confronted with the 2020 election call point and the January 6th element. But any takeaways that are going to have any lasting legacy here?
I don't think it matters a whole lot to the outcome of the election. Vance probably helped himself a little bit by giving a lot of Americans the first full introduction that was more kind of affable Midwestern young man than it was the kind of hard charging. Walz could have done better. It obviously wasn't a good format for him. I think there was nervousness about his performance going in, and he confirmed the reason for that nervousness because he wasn't that effective in that format. And I think Democrats were happy to get it over with, to tell you the truth. I just don't think VPs matter all that much generally, and certainly in the age of Trump, when so much of politics revolves around which side of Trump you're on. I don't think it matters a whole heck of a lot to the final outcome. Nate?
Yeah, no, look, I 100% agree. I mean, it is now 2 days later, and, this is probably the last conversation any of us wants to have about that debate. I don't think anyone else is talking about it anywhere else either.
So, Jonathan, given everything you guys have just been saying, let me tap into then your long political instincts here as a longtime reporter.
Yeah.
And that is what you're hearing from inside the camps of the two, in terms of confidence versus concern, and whether that, how that's influencing your thinking.
I think the Trump folks are more confident than the Harris people. The Trump campaign insists that he's leading in every battleground state in their polling, except for Wisconsin. That they just believe that this is a change election, that people are upset with the status quo, especially on inflation and the border, and they're not going to vote for somebody from the current administration. That's a pretty simple theory of the case. I think the Harris people say publicly that they are the underdogs. I think privately they tend to believe that that's the case, maybe a tad closer to being tied than they are the underdogs. And I think that they have the same concerns about the polling not fully counting Trump's support that everybody involved in politics does, and that they're curious how many folks they can bring over from the Republican Party. Nate will appreciate this. I've been struck by how consumed a lot of the Harris people are with trying to win over kind of moderate Republicans, and how many voters they see up for grabs. And keep in mind, there's not a lot of folks up for grabs, but those who are up for grabs, kind of one-time Republicans. And, I think seeing Harris on the campaign trail with Liz Cheney in Wisconsin this week is a real tell that they know that they've got to target more of those Republicans, that they have to practice what's called the politics of reassurance, trying to convey to moderate voters and even former Republicans or kind of soft Republicans that you can vote for Harris. Come on in, the water is safe. She's not some radical California lefty. If the Cheney family can go there, so can you. And I'm really curious to see how much more they lean into that, Kevin. No Democratic nominee has the latitude with his or her party base that Kamala Harris has this fall. Right. They're not going to say a word. She could come out for a preemptive war against Iran and putting the capital gains tax cut in half or capital gains rate in half, and her base wouldn't say boo. They just want to beat Trump. And so I'm eager to see how much she sort of leverages that long leash that she has with her own base.
Yeah, and look, I think what's interesting too, it's not just the fact that she's campaigning with Liz Cheney and that she is making this effort to attract independent to Republican-leaning voters. It is also where she is campaigning, right? She is in a part of Wisconsin today that Democrats mostly don't go to. And when she goes to Georgia, she's going to parts of the state that Democrats mostly don't go to. And this is a strategy that's well informed. The fact that she's got a campaign team that includes veterans from Ralph Warnock's successful Senate campaigns is really what's informing part of the strategy. Warnock had a lot of success in going into non-traditional for Democrats parts of Georgia, and it wasn't with the goal of winning those communities. It was with the goal of beefing up the numbers enough there to offset some of the Republican advantage.
That's right.
I think what we're going to be seeing in Wisconsin, we're going to see it in Pennsylvania, we're going to see that in Michigan, we'll see it in Georgia, is, it is an effort to go to places that Democrats don't normally go.
Yep.
Is there any incentive in either camp right now for another debate to appear all of a sudden? I know there's one sort of technically scheduled with CNN later this month, but will it materialize?
Well, the Harris campaign certainly wants a second debate, Kevin. And I think that's in part because of what I was just saying. They know that they have work to do in telling Kamala Harris's story, that a lot of voters don't know a ton about her, that they crave one of those tentpole moments, as they call it, where you can get 70, 80 million people in this country seeing it. And they know that she's good at it. That's the other thing. They know her strengths and her weaknesses. And they know that when she has prep time, she can come out and unfurl, 32 pre-cooked lines, baiting Trump and delivering her message. She's really darn good. She's a prosecutor. And they know that she's not nearly as effective when she's doing the kind of back and forth off the cuff in a TV interview. It's just not her strength. So they crave a second debate, and they're hoping Trump changes his mind. It's kind of interesting, and Nate will appreciate this, because the history of campaigns is that the candidate who lost the initial debate typically wants a couple more, and the person who did the best at the first debate typically says, all right, we're good. Let's leave it up to the voters now. It's the mirror here this time around. I think it's because Harris knows that she has more to convey and sort of more to explain about her background and her vision. And I think with Trump, they know it's just never going to be a good format for him, and that she's always going to outshine him.
Of course, he said he won the debate, so maybe that's goes into his thinking as well.
There you go. Yeah.
I mentioned at the top
can I just say also, Kevin, I think Trump still also has regret over doing that first debate in June. And I think there's some buyer's remorse that he took the bait in June, because obviously he's so bitter that Biden dropped out, because that was the bargain. He was going to run against Biden, right? And I think the back of his mind, I think Trump's kind of soured on debates.
Yeah, it's amazing to consider what would have happened if that debate hadn't occurred until after the Democratic convention.
How history turns, exactly. Yeah.
There, as I mentioned at the time, that's why I asked this potential debate question. There are no other major sort of scheduled events out there. Even the next Fed rate decision doesn't come until after the election, as an example. But when you look at some of these things out there, Nate alluded to the hurricane aftermath, of course, and especially the impact on North Carolina. But escalating war in the Middle East, a potential nuclear test out of North Korea, the strikes on the East Coast port system, the special counsel's filing with the judge. Any of these kind of quote unquote October surprise type issues that you're keeping a particularly close eye on?
I mean, look, you just named 4 things that happened this week.
Yeah, exactly.
Melania Trump coming out supporting abortion rights. There you go.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the nature of the October surprises is, it's not even the things that happen at the beginning of October. It is, it's what's going to happen next week and the week after and the week after that. And I think look, obviously it's the nature of surprises. We don't know what's going to happen that is directly going to impact this race. Obviously, the possibility that a port strike that is elongated and could have an actual effect on supply chains and the economy and consumer prices in some way has got to be a concern for the Harris team. But it's very early into this, right? That strike started 2 days ago. Obviously the question of the federal response to Hurricane Helene and how that is seen as a judgment on Biden and Harris is something that is going to end up playing a role here. The question of what happens in the Middle East, I'm not sure that voters are paying as much attention to, although, when we talk about a race as close as this one is, on the margins, these things could have an effect when you're talking about, for instance, an Arab American population in Michigan or sets of voters who are spending a lot of time thinking about how Biden and Harris are approaching the policy in the Middle East. All of these things kind of play out in the backdrop, and they are difficult to really assess what the day-to-day impact on the race is at this point. None of them kind of rises to the level of the Comey letter dropping 10 days before the election. None of them rises to the level of the question of how a campaign deals with a Hunter Biden laptop situation or an Access Hollywood tape, right? They are geopolitical dynamics where the reaction and the response to them is going to in some way get baked into voter perceptions over time to a degree.
Don't forget there's a great Donald Rumsfeld line that I'm sure you guys recall about known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And, we kind of know the known unknowns. Is there going to be a wider war in the Middle East? Here's we're on the way to one. Obviously, this dock strike, it has started. How soon will it end? What are the implications for the supply chain? But we also have to try to be more imaginative about what else could emerge to impact this election. And with such a sort of marginal, race where anything matters, I think sort of any kind of late news could shape the race. I mean, just to follow up on what Nate said about Michigan, I mean, I do think Michigan's precarious for Harris. I think the focus on Pennsylvania has been for good reason. It's an enormously important state and was very close in 2020, and Biden won it in part because he had roots there. But I think we shouldn't overlook Michigan because there's no state of the 7 battlegrounds that is really as sort of tied to the Middle East as Michigan. And it's kind of there's sort of equilibrium there that Harris is trying to strike. She doesn't want to be overly sympathetic to the Israelis because then you alienate the Arab community. At the same time, if you come out and you break with Biden, you take a more affirmative pro-Palestinian stance, you alienate the Jewish community. It's a really difficult state in that sense politically, and I think it just got harder this week for Harris.
Not to digress too far here, but Nate, just going back to something you brought up a moment ago with regards to the port strike. At this point, the president has taken essentially invoking Taft-Hartley off of the table. But at what point does that, how long can this go before that calculus for the good of the economy, irrespective of political ramifications, comes back onto the table?
It's an interesting question, Kevin, in part because, look, if you look at recent history on this, and there's not much, George W. Bush didn't invoke Taft-Hartley until 11 days into a strike. And this was a guy who did not have the same relationship and strong convictions about collective bargaining and the labor movement that Joe Biden does. I would find it to be extraordinary if Biden feels any pressure to be considering invoking Taft-Hartley at any point, period. Obviously, at some point, political considerations and economic considerations could kick in, but he has been kind of as direct as you can be in laying out that this is a collective bargaining issue, and he is not going to stand in the way of collective bargaining. And I think, there's probably some political calculation to that as well, but I also think it's very consistent with where he has been on these issues broadly.
Got it. So let's shift here a little bit and let's talk about money, Jonathan. I mean, I think we're starting to see some of the Q3 numbers come in, not just on the at the presidential level, but down ballot, and some pretty extraordinary numbers on the Democratic side thus far. I haven't seen as much of the Republican reporting as yet on this front. Also, a Politico report just yesterday with regards to this kind of shift in the national senatorial campaign, but on the other hand, Hillary Clinton had like a 2-to-1 money advantage, and she lost. Biden easily outraised Trump in 2020, barely won, as you pointed out. So, I mean, she's outraising and she's got more money, but, and it's a massive amount of money, chasing an ever shrinking pool of persuadable voters. But I guess everyone counts, so you got to spend where you think you can make a marginal gain.
The rule of thumb in politics is that money matters more the further down the ballot you go. For a presidential, if folks know these candidates or they're going to know these candidates by election day, it's a bit of a diminishing value. That said, it is important to note that the campaigns, their hard dollars, the money that the candidates themselves raise, does go further because they can get cheaper advertising rates at local TV stations for the all-important local TV ads, broadcast TV ads, than the super PACs. Super PACs have to pay a much higher rate than the campaigns do for those ads. So the money goes a lot further that the candidates themselves raise, and Harris is going to decisively outraise Trump. The other place where it matters, we haven't talked about this yet, but this is important, and that is the ground game and creating an extensive county by county field organization in the battleground states. And I think Harris is going to have an opportunity to create sort of much more robust field organization than Trump. I've heard this so many times for people both at the campaigns and also in states, which is that Trump really has taken a risk by outsourcing his ground game to third-party groups.
And what do you guys, what's your assessment or what are you hearing about the efficacy of that strategy of outsourcing? Just in terms of, I mean, even if there's anecdotal, I mean, you hear about the doors getting knocked on and so on and so forth, and there's been some anecdotal suggestion media that there's, it's been not as visible on the Republican side, but I don't know if that actually.
No, that jives with what I've heard, Kevin, that the left hand isn't always talking to the right hand, and that counting on some of these groups like Turning Point, this far right group, has been kind of a fiasco. Actually, that they're not that organized, and they're not using their money to create an effective ground game. And I come back to this. This is a marginal race. If she's able to orchestrate a much more effective GOTV, get out the vote operation going into the election, that could be the difference in 8,000 votes, and that could be the election.
That's absolutely right. And look, all we have is anecdotes at this point, Kevin. At some point when it is convenient for them, either campaign may start releasing some numbers to show voter contact. But even that you would take with a grain of salt. It is true that the Harris operation is in some ways kind of bringing the band back together from the really spectacular Obama campaigns. Obviously, the Biden campaign in 2020 didn't have a traditional GOTV operation because of the pandemic. So, they're kind of digging back to what 2008 and 2012 did. And bringing in some of the same people, and obviously the tools and the tactics have changed and evolved a little bit over time, but these people know how to turn out the vote, and they are activated. And look, one of the effects of Harris replacing Biden on the campaign and on the ticket is they have a huge surge in enthusiasm for volunteers, right? They have people who want to volunteer and make phone calls and knock on doors and contact their neighbors, which was just going to be less true with Biden, where that enthusiasm was not going to be there. The question is how you use and deploy all of these volunteers and really organize it into something that, to Jonathan's point, can actually turn out some number of voters that can end up making a difference. We don't know as much about what's happening on the Republican side because there are these kind of incipient third-party organizations that are now tasked with doing this, because some of this stuff is very much still in motion, because, again, their GOTV operation differs from Democrats in the sense of emphasizing more election day voting and less early voting. You're not really going to know until it's over how effective that has been. You can kind of see some evidence and anecdotes of it along the way. But, wouldn't assume that Republicans are going to completely tank on it, but it doesn't feel like they've got as sharp an operation as Democrats do right now.
So let's talk about something then that's not anecdotal, right? So you've talked about, I mean, the most obvious manifestation of the money spend is obviously in advertising and the like. And I'm so glad I don't live in a battleground state to have to endure all of that advertising. But and you've just talked about the ground game. We also know that the post-election legal prep is being spent on as well, right? I know that that Republican groups have already filed some 90 preemptive lawsuits challenging voting rules and practices, which is, I think, three times what we saw in 2020 already. What's your sense, Jonathan, of what's going on in terms of, on both sides, in terms of prep on the post-election battleground?
Both parties know that Donald Trump's never going to concede the election, and if he defeats, he's going to deny. I'm sorry, if he loses, he's going to deny the results, and he's going to try to fight this. I mean, that nobody's deluding themselves otherwise. That we're going to see some similarities to 2020. There's going to be a longer count because some of these states, they can't start counting the ballots until the election day itself, and so the early votes and the mail votes, you can't start counting. And that, because of the fact that the mail ballots can count as long as they're postmarked by election day in most states, a lot of these states are going to be counting after election day. That's normal. That's the nature of our sort of federalized process, where each state has their own election laws. But it just gives Trump the opportunity to sow misinformation and questions about the results if he loses. So. Both parties will lawyer up, and if Trump's the loser, he'll fight it and deny it, never concede. And if Trump's the winner, I have no doubt that the Democrats are going to look for opportunities to challenge the election too, if there are irregularities or issues that come up. Now, I don't expect Kamala Harris to deny the results of the election if Trump clearly wins. And that's the difference between her and Trump.
How concerned are you? I mean, you made the clear statement that Trump will never concede.
Right.
Now, I presume that we won't have a repeat of January 6th, at least in Washington. The Capitol will be an armed fortress this time, and there won't be any question of whether the vice president will certify the vote or not. But how concerned are you about this looming specter of politically related violence in and around the transfer of power?
It's the storm cloud hanging over all of us in Washington, and people are lying if they tell you otherwise. People are dreading the possibility of unrest, violence, and Lord knows what else could happen in the weeks after the election. I was in the Capitol on January 6th. I co-wrote a book in part about the aftermath of the 2020 election and the experience of January 6th. You're right. It's not going to be the same because you have a Republican, so you have a Democratic Senate, you have a Democratic Vice President. But what's certainly possible is that Trump could try to fight the election results and could stir up, people to march into the streets and become violent, and that is a very real possibility. There's a precedent for it, and so we have to be very concerned about that. Obviously, Biden controls the National Guard, so at least there's that. But it's tragic, right? This is America. We shouldn't have to be thinking about violence in the aftermath of our elections. That's not supposed to happen here, right? And so it's kind of heartbreaking to even think about.
Do you think that the media on election night and immediately thereafter what are the lessons learned by the media from 2020? Obviously, we'll all remember Fox being on the receiving end after they called
Yeah.
as an example. But I mean, how will they approach this any differently than they have?
Well, I'm sure Fox will be a lot more careful because they lost a good chunk of their viewership for a few months after 2020, when they called the election for Biden. I got to be candid though, and as they say in court, I'm arguing against interest here, but the media doesn't have the gatekeeping role that we had 40, 50 years ago. The idea that like the press can truly shape public sentiment is greatly diminished, right? Because so many people, especially if they're Trump supporters, they're skeptical of the media to start with, right? They're looking for any reason to doubt the press. And also, Kevin, what even is the media anymore,
Yeah.
right? And it's not like people are like picking up the morning paper in their driveway and watching Walter Cronkite at night, and then that world's kind of gone. So the media social media has transformed our news landscape. So I just I don't have a lot of confidence that anything the press says or does would appreciably convince people that the election is one way or the other. I do think Fox will be more careful now, because obviously they know that a lot of their audience doesn't want to hear that Trump lost. So that'll be interesting to see. I just am skeptical that we collectively have a lot of power in this sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true too. Sorry, Kevin, what did you say?
I said, he says careful. Jonathan says Fox will be more careful, but at the end of the day, they did make the accurate call. But go ahead.
They made the accurate call. They were also the outlier in calling as early as they did. And I think, probably what is going to happen this time is that while they are not the gatekeeper function or the ultimate arbiter to sway voter opinions, what they are going to be is kind of the level setter in terms of, look, if it's election night and a lot of votes still haven't been counted yet and Donald Trump has declared victory no matter what, they will be the ones saying, look, here's what's still out there, here's what's still coming in, here's why the race isn't called yet, here's what the realistic timetable on all of this looks like. And I think it won't be unusual if we do see that, just like in 2020, this does take several days. There is going to be a lag in terms of when some of the early and absentee votes get counted. There is going to be a bias in some states towards showing the totals for election day votes and not having a full tally yet on the early votes. And that stuff is going to be playing out in real time on television screens after the polls close. It will be the media's job, CNN, ABC, NBC, and everyone else, to say, here's what's in, here's what's still outstanding, right? And I think that's probably the most that we should and can expect in terms of the kind of information that viewers are going to be getting when polls close and all the way through an actual declared victor.
Nate, I know you wanted to ask some questions of Jonathan with regards to digging in a little bit more into his book, This Will Not Pass. And maybe I can just tee it up by saying, one of the things that polls continue to show is that the electorate doesn't know Kamala Harris quite yet. And so, a lot of your book is about the early days, post the 2020 election and into the transition and so on and so forth. About the dynamic between the Biden and Harris camps within the White House and the West Wing.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about her, and give us some color on.
Sure. So I first met Kamala Harris 10 years ago when she was the Attorney General of California. We had lunch in San Francisco. Some of your listeners who know the Ferry Building, a great spot there on the water in San Francisco. And I found her to be really engaging, charming, formidable, charismatic, and somebody who obviously would go in places and had ambitions to go beyond California. The person I covered when she ran for president in 2019 and 2020 was wholly different. And the person who became VP for 3 years was wholly different. She lost her mojo. She lost her swagger. I think when she left California, she had a hard time adapting first to the campaign trail, then to Washington. She just didn't know DC. She was a California animal who had trouble, I think, adjusting to politics beyond beyond her home state. And I think she lost a lot of her confidence when she was running for president because she had such high hopes. And boy, she didn't even make 2020. She dropped it out before the new year, didn't even make the Iowa caucuses. Obviously, Biden revives her career by making her VP. But, Biden knows so many people at home and abroad. Biden had relationships. Biden knew the shorthand of so many leaders in both parties, so many foreign officials. And she just didn't have that kind of, like I said, shorthand relationships and connections. So it's been all the more remarkable to see her the last 2 months because I've been reminded of the person that I first met, who does have confidence, does have swagger, and has real political talent. And I think that she has got to show more of that in the final few weeks. And if she does, I think she ought to win. I think she had trouble finding her footing, and Nate will appreciate this, having worked in a White House, because there was no obvious role for her, right? Think about this. She was kind of a throwback to the understudy type role that we had for decades in this country with VPs. But really, from Cheney to Biden to Pence, the last three VPs before her were a different model. That was the sort of DC elder or the policy elder kind of tutoring the younger president. Well, that wasn't the case this time. And she didn't have an obvious niche. And the one niche that she was thrown into, which was, immigration, obviously was not ideal for her politically. So it was kind of a rocky time. We talk about that a lot in the book, her trying to find her footing. She's always gone through staff. She's always had personnel problems. And I think that was magnified this time around, which has been why it's all the more striking that she's had sort of continuity on this campaign, and probably a blessing for her that she had a campaign that only had the last 100 days.
Yeah. I mean, look, it is one thing, and I went back and read some of the passages, and this will not pass before this, Jonathan. The tensions between her and her team and the Biden's team, between her and some of the Biden staff.
Yes.
Really acute, obviously, in those early days.
Yes.
To me, I mean, to your point, it is really difficult just reading those passages to then fast forward and seeing her absorb and inherit the infrastructure and then build on it seamlessly as she seems to have done.
I know.
And I wonder, what you would attribute that to. I mean, is that just the speed and the compression and the, unified desire to beat Donald Trump?
Yes. Look, the theory of the case I have for all of modern politics is that Trump is the equivalent in this moment, in the last decade, to what the Civil War was for decades after that in the 19th century. Everything revolves around Trump, support or oppose. And I think Democrats have created a coalition that is knitted together entirely out of opposition to Trump. He's the best organizer, motivator, and frankly, unifier that Democrats have. And I think that's been a godsend for her. That's why I mentioned this earlier. She has such latitude to run toward the political center because the party just wants to beat Trump. And those center versus left factions can fight again after the election. But for now, they're all kind of laying down arms because they just want to beat Trump so badly. Yeah, Nate, look, I think a lot of her challenges have been papered over because the party is facing the restoration of somebody who they genuinely believe poses a threat to the country, and they just want to stop him. And I think that has been a huge help to her, but also give her credit. She's run a strong campaign. She has performed in a way that we didn't really see the last 3.5 years. And everybody in the West Wing and on the campaign has mostly just made the best of it. They changed the name on the letterhead. They've adapted the campaign for her. But you're right. It's similar personnel. It's still based in Delaware. But they've just sort of tried to make this thing work the best they can because they had no real choice. This will be left to history. But guys, I do wonder if this thing would have gone as smoothly if Biden had not held out as long as he did. Biden waited almost a full month after that debate before he finally dropped out. I do wonder if he had dropped out sooner, would there have been a more contentious summer with Democrats scrambling to be his successor? I think by holding on as long as he did, the party was so desperate to stop the infighting, to heal the wounds, to focus on Trump again, that it really gave her an advantage because there was no appetite for any more infighting. They just wanted to get back to the main event, and the main event's beating Trump.
And I want to look at this notion that you just brought up, that Trump is sort of the focus of the national discussion and dispute.
Both parties, yeah,
right. And we can have an entire discussion about this very subject, but I can't let you go. And we only have a few minutes left. I can't let you go without asking this, because you put together a somewhat provocative column last month. If Republicans want to win, they need Trump to lose big. So talk about that. What does the future, and you were very careful to talk about a post-Trump, not an anti-Trump Republican Party. And so talk about what you think would transpire.
I think it's the best case scenario for the Republican Party to start moving beyond Trump sooner rather than later. Look, they are not going to be a fully national party as long as they're a Trump party. He's going to get between 46 and 47.5% of the vote. He's a minority leader. That's been the case since his first campaign. He ensures that the nomination of candidates down ticket that are surefire losers. Look no further than what's happened in North Carolina. There's no reason why Democrats should have a gimme governorship there. That's a competitive state, and it's a Republican-leading state, really. But this is what Trump has wrought, and it is enormously powerful within the party, but it's hugely alienating for the general population. Now, because of the nature of the Senate map and because of the nature of the Electoral College, it's not like we're back to the 1980s where there were huge blowout kind of margins. Republicans are never going to lose that badly because the country is so divided. Which, by the way, is also why it's harder for the Reformation to get underway, because it's so competitive. That said, look, if Trump loses, you can get back to creating an oppositional force against an incumbent Democratic president. You have a good midterm in 2026 because that's the sixth year of a Democratic administration. Typically, the 6-year itch is good for the party out of power. And then in 2028, when Trump would be 82, he will probably flirt with running for a fourth time. But you probably are able to put together a nomination for somebody that can sort of harness the pre-Trump party and the post-Trump party. And perhaps, you finally can win. Republicans, guys, have won the popular vote one time since the fall of the Berlin Wall.
And that was a two-war post 9/11.
Two wars, incumbent President George W. Bush, and he didn't win by a lot. So, the Republican Party has got to figure out a way that they can retain a lot of their kind of Trumpy base, but appeal to the broader electorate. And they're just not going to do that as long as they're the party of Trump.
You actually, speaking of historical dates, you made a remarkable point in one of your columns that if Harris were to win, she would be the first Democrat to enter the White House since 1884 without majorities in both chambers, assuming the Republicans take control of the Senate.
Isn't that incredible? I tell people that of the House, the Senate, and the White House, probably the surest bet, although I think none of those three are super safe, but the surest bet's probably the Republicans will flip the Senate and have 51 seats or more in the Senate. And that would ensure that Harris would come to the White House with divided government if she were to win. That she would, both in terms of personnel, her cabinet, her appointees, face challenges. And in terms of policy, she would not be able to immediately start implementing her agenda. That compromise would be the order of the day, personnel in with policy. And I think, by the way, guys, she can leverage that to her favor. It may anger Chuck Schumer, God love him, but if she needs more ways to reach out to the center, she can lean into that. She can say, look, we may well have divided government next year in Washington. Let's get stuff done. The country is tired of extremes. They're tired of sort of angry rhetoric. Let's come together and govern from the center. And boy, I think she'll have no choice next year, because every Democratic president has always come to the White House with majorities in both chambers. Since 1884, Grover Cleveland won, for you history junkies. And it would be very different for her next year in Washington.
Well, guys, and I think the follow-up question to that, and we can discuss this on another call, would be, if Trump is the best force for Democratic unity, how does that big tent devolve after he leaves the scene as well?
But Kevin, it's the great question in both parties. What happens the day after Trump? and
Yeah.
the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. What do they both stand for? It's a fascinating question.
So let me just ask the two of you, and maybe Nate, you can start and give Jonathan the last word here. We'll kind of go back to where we started this conversation. The election's on a knife's edge here, and I don't know if either one of you wants to pose it a prediction at this point, but maybe more importantly, I mean, it's a little bit of a cliche to talk about this, I suppose, but at the end of the day, how consequential is this election? I mean, if Clinton had lost to Bob Dole, if George W. Bush had lost to Kerry, it's unclear if the world would be in a completely different place.
Yeah.
There seems to be a view that this election actually is incredibly consequential. I just wonder if you two agree with that.
Look, I think this election is consequential, but I think that the Clinton-Dole election was consequential, and I think the Bush-Gore election was consequential, and I think re-elections are consequential, right? I think all of these have an impact in huge, huge ways, and I'm not bombastic about what the consequences of this election are. I mean, obviously, Jonathan alluded to what some of the risks are, and the overall political environment right now is really unfortunate. I think it is going to be consequential for all sorts of reasons, right? The direction of policy next year is going to be forced on whoever the president is because there's going to be a tax debate coming up. The question of the size of the deficit and the debt is going to be forced on the next president one way or another. And, the outcome of this race, the outcome of the congressional races is really going to set a direction fairly early on for both taxes and the overall budget and the debt and deficit. I think the questions of continued investments in manufacturing, outcome of foreign policy, direction of relationships with allies, disposition towards traditional adversaries, all of these things are up for grabs right now.
Yeah.
Right? So if you put aside the question of, is this consequential from the future of democracy perspective, I think what you actually have is a really kind of stark difference between the candidates and between the parties right now across a whole host of policy issues. And it's those policy issues that I think that are really on the ballot this year, whether or not voters choose to acknowledge it that way or not. But that's the consequential piece of this.
Trump unbound on foreign policy and domestic policy would mark a dramatic shift in this country. Certainly, if he implements a sort of tariff regime that he's talking about, would have massive implications for the economy. If he really is going to create a more isolationist country and sort of ease away from our alliances, would have massive global repercussions. We don't know how much he'll follow through. We don't know what Trump 2 looks like because we don't know how constrained he'll be. We don't know how shaped he'll be by media coverage, which obviously is always the biggest question with Trump. But the possibility, I think, this time around are much, much, much more sobering than a Clinton-Dole 96, where you're playing between the 40-yard lines of American politics. With Trump, you're talking about the possibility of being outside the stadium altogether. So I think it's an enormously consequential election. And perhaps the second most consequential election, the 2016, which obviously Trump won, got the 3 Supreme Court picks, and we now have a 6-3 majority on the court for conservatives. That's a huge election, too. I think this one could be as big, perhaps bigger.
32 days from now, we will start to answer this question. I want to thank Jonathan Martin and Nate Tamarin for joining me today. We will obviously continue to be following this very closely at Teneo. If this provokes any questions that our colleagues in Washington can answer, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at Teneo Insights at Teneo.com. We will continue our election coverage as we head into the election. But until then, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Thanks for joining and have a great day.